Hey everyone, welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in controlling groups, also known as cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left their groups. I'm Deanna, and I am so excited to welcome you back for a third season of the show. I wasn't sure if it was going to be possible, yet here we are. We're going to be doing things a bit differently this season with a new structure to the show. We'll still feature the stories of people who grew up in cults, but this time we're going to be a little more organized while broadening our focus, bringing in some new voices, and incorporating themes. This episode's theme is, what is a cult? It seems like a basic question, but it's one that I get all the time, and appears to have a multitude of answers, depending on who you speak with. Today, we'll be discussing this question with our guest toward the end of the show. And our guest is Ashlen Hilliard, who you are actually going to be hearing a lot more throughout the season because she has been helping me out with interviews and discussions. So I'd like you to get to know her a little bit better. Ashlen grew up in a controlling Christian organization in Utah, and after leaving the group, became known for her work helping women escape polygamist organizations. She also served as the director of events for the International Cultic Studies Association. And she was my classmate basically through the pandemic, as we both studied for and received very recently our graduate degrees in the psychology of coercive control. And as if that wasn't enough, Ashlen has just started her own LLC to help people leaving cults. And that organization is called People Leave Cults. So Ashlen, welcome. Thank you for being here today and for all your work on this season.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
I really have spent just such a wonderful time helping you in any ways that I could with this season. Thank you for reaching out to even get me involved in this process.
Well, it's been great to have you, and I think that our listeners will really enjoy hearing your voice as well throughout the season. So let's get into it. Let's talk about you.
Wonderful. That sounds great.
So I was born and raised in a very conservative branch of the Church of Christ. There are a lot of different types of churches of Christ, so I kind of put that out as like a caution. You have the International Churches of Christ. They're probably the most well-known in the cultic studies field. Kit McKean was one of their leaders. They also went by the Boston movement. And so in the cultic studies field, a lot of focus has been on the International Churches of Christ, and for good reason. I mean, they had a very charismatic leader. But the branch that I originated from, they're very conservative in nature, non-institutionalized, so they don't have any sort of governing body or any sort of governing leadership. They're non-denominational, so to speak. And they are also known as the Antis. That's A-N-T-I, the Antis, because they are anti a lot of things. So I left the anti movement of the Church of Christ.
Okay. And since the show is called Generation Cult, and obviously we're focusing on more controlling groups, I wanted to ask what, in your mind, makes this group different than your just regular mainstream Christian church down the street? What made it more high control?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question and a really important question because spiritual abuse can happen in that church down the street.
Mm-hmm.
But in my group, because it was non-denominational, each church operates independently, if that makes sense. So if you went to a conservative Church of Christ in California, you could also go into a conservative Church of Christ somewhere on the East Coast. And if they are of the same beliefs and practices, you're going to hear pretty much the same sort of language being taught. You're going to notice the same sort of traditions during the worship service. And that is because this particular thread of the Church of Christ has a very thought-reforming process in which they view the scriptures. So there is this methodology. It is a hermeneutical methodology, which sounds like a scary word, but all that means is they have a sort of system by which they interpret the Bible, by which they interpret the scriptures. And they teach this system, and they say that we go about learning the scriptures, and it's got to be in accordance with God's authority. But what that causes is when there's only one right way to interpret the Bible, to inform, what we do in the service, how we go about living our lives, is it's a very thought reforming particular technique. And it really makes this group different than a lot of groups. There isn't just one charismatic leader, although individual congregations may have a preacher, that can exist in any circumstance. But the way in which this particular movement, church, employs coercive control is through how you interpret the scripture. And if you don't interpret the scripture in that way, that could be a salvation issue for you. And it's very isolating in that it also teaches you that all these other churches that are going on, like the church down the street, like you said, Deanna, they are at risk for not being saved because they don't employ the same critical thinking techniques that we do when it comes to interpreting scriptural issues.
So there just wasn't a lot of wiggle room. It was black and white. It was like this or nothing.
Very black and white.
Yeah.
Yeah, this or nothing. And there's a lot of reasons why they were called the antis. There's a lot of history of controversial arguments within the worship service, and there's so much history behind that. But what's really fascinating is, I'll give you an example. This Church of Christ movement is known for not having instruments during the worship service. So, for example, the church down the street most likely has a guitar that aids in worship service. They'll be playing a guitar, they'll be singing. That's pretty common in many Christian. In fact, it's almost unusual if someone doesn't have an instrument to kind of aid in worship service during that time. But our group was so anti-instrumental worship that we were a cappella only. And that's because in the New Testament, which they saw as the new law, there was no explicit examples of Christ and the apostles or churches that were operating in the book of Acts as using guitars or harps or tambourines or anything when it came to worshiping and singing. The only scriptures that are available talk about singing from your heart. And so this group takes that very, very literally. And they say, we're not authorized to use instruments in our worship from the New Testament example. Therefore, this can be a salvation issue. And churches that do use instruments may be at risk to going to hell. So it's a very sort of literalist view of scripture. And yet it's interesting because in the book of Revelation, you see it talks a lot about angels with harps, but because that's more end times imagery, they don't count that as an example to follow. So the scripture is taken very literally, and it's very cherry picked, so to speak, as to where they draw the line on certain issues.
And did that apply to your life outside the church?
Actually, no. I listened to all kinds of music growing up. I love Led Zeppelin. I was a drummer. I was very much into rock and roll growing up. My parents always had the latest Styx CD in the car, which I loved to blast. So I grew up in a house that loved music. But when it came to the worship setting on Sunday mornings, when you're actively worshiping, no instruments can be involved.
Yeah, well, going past instruments, it sounds like there were very strict rules as far as what you could do in the church. How did that apply to your community? Do you feel like you were closed off and limited, or did you feel like outside the church you had more options?
Yeah, I think it more so made me really sad because, hearing these concepts from a very young age, we have to do it this way, that implied that looking outside of the church into my broader community, that they would not be saved because, they had different traditions or different beliefs. So that was kind of the result of adhering to this particular hermeneutical methodology and applying scriptures and learning about it. So it was very discouraging, and it was very interesting because I grew up in Utah. And when people hear that I grew up in Utah, they assume that I was born and raised LDS Mormon, but actually no. I was in a very, very small bubble within another conservative bubble, which was the Mormon LDS church and community. To kind of give context, there are only 3 churches of Christ that are considered the type that I would have grown up in the entire state of Utah. And so my group was very, very small. It's majority in the American South, in the Bible Belt area. That's where the most of these churches are. And a lot of Church of Christers in the Utah region were made up of military families who maybe came from the American South, or, they're stationed out in Utah, so they gather together that way. But it was so interesting. I grew up in Kaysville, Utah, and I went to a huge public school there. And it was one of the most concentrated LDS areas north of Salt Lake City. So I was full blown immersed in Mormon culture. I was very isolated in that regard, being one of the only non Mormon kids in my
Mm.
entire 5A high school. That was
Yeah, I
wild.
can't even imagine what that would have been like.
Yeah, it was tough. I had teachers who'd pull out the Book of Mormon and during class and would just start reading.
Whoa.
It's like church and state doesn't really exist there because, the church is so the church is so behind, the LDS church is so behind a lot of the law, policies, local governance issues. And so it's hard to explain to people, like, not only did I feel like I didn't have good friends in the church I grew up in, but the friends that I did have were also part of a high demand religious group. And so I think we found a lot in common that way. I had a lot of dear friends who were LDS who were just great. And I think we found a lot in common through our experiences, even though we may not have known why at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that might cause some conflicts, you being in a religion that is so strict as far as what it believes to be true or what it even considers, and then surrounded by Mormons who obviously their ideology differs a bit from
Yeah,
yours. I mean, was that awkward or?
absolutely. I mean, they were constantly trying to convert me. I felt like I had to read and really deep dive into their religion so that I was prepared. I remember when we first moved there, I was a military brat. So my dad was Air Force and we moved around a lot. And when I moved there right before I started fourth grade, I don't remember much from fourth grade. I don't know many people who do, but what I do remember was one of the first things that was told to me was from another student in my class who asked, "Are you Mormon?" I mean, before they even knew my name, they asked, "Are you Mormon?"
Oh,
And I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Oh, you are. You just don't know it yet."
oh,
Oh, how ominous. And I was a fourth grader. So that's something that stuck with me for a long time. And in some ways, I felt like I could only get so close to a lot of my friends until I started to see sort of the end game. They're very evangelistically fueled. That culture is.
mm,
And there's so many activities outside of church for those within the LDS that further strengthens community bonds. And they have great communities, great schools, great families. That's what they're known for. And it was very hard being an outsider. I read the Book of Mormon. I studied Doctrine and Covenants. I did everything that I could to kind of, I guess, prepare myself for psychological battle, so to speak. So if I did get cornered in a conversation, I would kind of know where they were coming from. And that changed my perspective a lot throughout time, and my approach throughout time. But there's also times where I was trying to convert them. I used to go stand outside of Temple Square in Salt Lake City, and sometimes I'd get in trouble by the authorities down there, not the police authorities, but the temple the temple people for being there, and would do a lot of street evangelism. I was pretty fearless about that. So it was constantly, I was trying to convert them or they were trying to convert me, and that was tough, really tough.
I bet it was. And yeah, that leads me to my next question. How devout were you in your own religion? Like, did you wholeheartedly believe in all of it, or were you swayed at all?
I don't think that I was ever that I was truly a believer in that particular church. I was certainly a believer in Christianity, but I saw a lot of issues within local churches. I have been through churches that had gone through terrible splits for wild reasons. At one point, my family helped start a church with another family out in Texas. So I had seen a lot of ugliness to the church that I was raised in, a lot of conflict and issues. And I was more from a position of, I wish we had unity. I wish we were more involved in the community. There wasn't any sort of community outreach. There was no donating to community organizations. There was no doing what normal churches do. There was no like food pantry. There was no there was no sort of any attempt for community outreach. It was so incredibly insular and strict. And it made me really sad, to be honest. And I think doing street evangelism actually with other Christians from all across the Salt Lake City Valley who were not a part of my group, it was through doing that kind of street evangelism that I realized, like, wow, these people have a totally different view of how to operate in church and what Christianity means. And I was certainly sold on the Christianity component at the time, but I very quickly let go of that Church of Christ affiliation. I learned a lot from doing street evangelism from people outside of the Church of Christ. It was very beneficial in opening my worldview. So I don't feel like I ever had a strong identity in the Church of Christ. It was certainly like what I did growing up and what I had to do. But I think if I had any kind of identity, it was more so in like the overarching like Christian beliefs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you liked the beliefs, but it sounds like at a young age you kind of recognized how rigid what you were in was and kind of connected with other people from the Christian faith.
Yes. Right. Outside of the group, more so than I connected with those in that insular church.
I see. So how did your parents get involved in this?
So my mom was also born and raised.
Oh.
My grandmother is living in Tampa. So within the church, there is a college. It's called Florida College. It's out in Tampa, Florida. It's very, very small. And a lot of the teachers, especially the men who teach Bible courses there, it's like a Christian college, they were some of the ones who led the breakoff sect of the Church of Christ, which I was raised in. So these were kind of like the guys who led the breakoff movement, who were a part of the anti-movement. And so it was really important to my parents. My grandmother was involved in that school. She went to that school. She worked for that college for a long time. My mom went to that college for a period of time. And then when I was old enough, I chose to go to that college to get my bachelor's degree. So it was very multi-generational, this influence on my mother's side.
Okay.
My dad, he just met my mom and he, was in the military. He was stationed in Florida. He's originally from West Virginia. And I don't believe he had any touch with it until he had met my mom. So he was not born and raised. But yeah, the college influence and getting involved in this very Church of Christ school was also very influential because not only do you have multi-generational church involvement, you also have multi-generational college involvement with the school that teaches, especially young men who are interested in being preachers for churches of Christ, and basically feeds these young people into churches across the United States. It's like a preacher training ground, essentially.
Wow. Okay.
So there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Let's touch on the multi-generational aspect. This podcast focuses on people who grew up in authoritarian groups, and a lot of times we refer to people like that as second-generation adults. But one thing that's been consistently pointed out to me through this time is that second generation isn't necessarily the most accurate because there are people like yourself who have gone through many generations within a group.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's what happened on your mom's side.
Yeah. And imagine the nightmare it was for someone like me to sort of depart from a lot of those traditions that were so multi-generational. There was a lot of systemic problems and issues and held beliefs. And when I wanted to leave the group, I was able to just leave. I wasn't like, handcuffed to a church pew or anything. But in so many ways, because of that generational influence, the impacts of me leaving really rocked a lot of things in our family system.
What actually triggered you to leave? Like, are there any traditions or anything in particular that really got to you that stands out now looking back?
For some people, there's like that one breaking point. There's like that one thing where they just can't take it anymore. I think for me, I was just seeing I was seeing the opposite of unity, really. I was just really like heartbroken and disgruntled at how insular the group was and how unwilling they were to accept people with different approaches. And I think, too, this was around the time when I was starting speech and debate at the college that I attended. I was learning a lot about argumentation, a lot about critical thinking, a lot about logical fallacies. And I started like when the preacher was talking, I would almost start like counter arguing in my head and would really start applying that to like a Sunday morning church setting. I had a lot of issues with the way that women were treated in the group, especially. We were basically like second class citizens. I had a lot of issues with the fact that there was such a lack of diversity in the group. And I had a lot of issues with the way that LGBTQ people and queer people were seen. And so I think a culmination of those things, just sort of being fed up, and really ultimately, I didn't want to be aligned with that and those belief systems anymore.
Tell me a little bit about how women and people in the LGBTQ community were perceived.
Yeah, I'll start with women. So women were not necessarily given a voice in any sort of leadership roles in the church. Women couldn't lead prayers. It was a men run Sunday morning system. And that may be more common, but to kind of take it up a notch, a woman could teach a Bible class, for example, with children. If a woman is teaching a class and there's a 13-year-old boy who decides to get baptized, I've seen instances where women can no longer teach the class, or they have to bring in a male counterpart because that 13-year-old boy now has some kind of authority
Ugh,
over that woman being baptized. Isn't that
that's
awful?
awful.
It's awful. So I've seen instances of that. That's not to say that every church is like that, but when you're dealing with really extreme churches of Christ, I've seen that happen, and it's very heartbreaking. So women, were instructed to be silent in the church, and you're just not really given a voice at all. I mean, men run the church, they have men's meetings, men are elders. I found it quite horrible. Meanwhile, we have to wear a dress or skirt to church and look our best for God.
Hmm.
That's wild to me. And when it comes to queer people in the church, there was a well-known person who practices reparative therapy, otherwise known as conversion therapy, if you've never heard the term
I
reparative.
have.
And he's now calling it reintegrative therapy. So it's amazing how these terms keep shifting, right? Because conversion therapy has had a really negative light, and reparative therapy, people have caught on, oh, that's like conversion therapy. It basically is. And now we're talking about reintegrative therapy. It's all the same. It's horrible. It's abusive. And he would travel to churches of Christ and would give sermons basically showing data as to how we can rid people of homosexual thoughts and tendencies. And I have a dear friend who studied this in depth, who's looked at said data, and it's not even it's not even real data. People say, well, he's not doing conversion therapy, he's doing reintegrative or reparative. But when you look on his site, one of the authors listed one of the books he recommends, and the way he learned was from Nicolosi. He was one of the pioneers of conversion therapy. So he believes that curing people of homosexuality is possible,
Just ridiculous.
which is really horrible. And it's something to be cured, is the way that it's seen. If someone comes out as like gay in the church, it's either, are you going to practice celibacy for the rest of your life then, or not? And if you're not welcome here. At the college I attended, it even went so far as to, I had friends who did not feel like it was even safe to come out, which it wasn't. There was a fear that they would get kicked out of school, which was a very real possibility if they came out at all. It was horrible. And I know for me, as someone who's bisexual, I wasn't even able to explore these ideas or come to terms with my sexuality until later in life. I didn't even have the vocabulary for these terms or what they meant, because we were so isolated in this college environment. And so the only thing that's presented is heterosexual marriage relationships.
That sounds really frustrating and isolating, especially if you want to explore other feelings you're having. So at what point then did you actually leave? How old were you? What was the process?
Yeah, so I graduated with my bachelor's in communication from this college. I decided to stay and stick it out and get my degree. And I graduated and then I got married. It was the whole ring by spring thing, which was like one of the mottos. And I did what a good Christian woman was supposed to do. And I got married at a very young age. I got married at 20 before I could legally drink alcohol. I got married to a man, and I'm very grateful. We've been married for 6 years, and I married my best friend. We left the church together, which was not easy. And then we moved back to Utah because I had missed my family for 3 years while I was in college. And very early on in our marriage, I was mentally out, but physically was still going to a Church of Christ. You know, my parents went to this church. My brother was there. I wanted to explore other options, but I was a little fearful that that would really hamper my relationship with my family. And early on in our marriage, when I was going to a church, I started having panic attacks in the church because it was just starting to really go against the core of everything that I had believed and developed, and I just could not take it anymore. And we met with the elders, and they met with us several times, and we couldn't do it. So we left, and that wasn't easy. We just stopped going. And they announced to the congregation that we had stopped going.
And what was your family's reaction to that?
Probably extremely embarrassed that their children and, you know, Ashlen's new husband had left. I think they were really looking forward to us moving back to Utah and being in the same church. And so I can only imagine the heartbreak, the embarrassment of having to hear from like the pulpit that Ashlen and Ryan, which is my partner's name, are not going to be in the church anymore. They've stopped going. So that was very strange. And we definitely church hopped after that. We still went to pretty conservative churches, but they'd have instruments in worship. They weren't churches of Christ. They were just like local community churches. So we church hopped for a long time. And we haven't been in a church in years. And that's been really good for us. But it was a weird process. It was a long process. But for me, it was like having panic attacks in the church building really meant that me at my core, my integrity, I could not stay in that kind of environment.
What do you think was triggering them? Was it just disagreeing so much, or?
I think certainly the disagreements, of course, like having my own perspective, being a woman in that environment was very impactful for me. For some women, especially older women in the group, I feel like they've just been doing it for so long. They may not have the same sort of emotional response like I had, you know, as a young woman who had goals and aspirations. And, you know, I was just very impacted by that. But also, I think what really kicked it off for me was I was sitting in a Bible class and we were going through this hermeneutical methodology. It's called CENI, CENI. It stands for Command, Example, Necessary Inference. And it is the group's way of interpreting scripture. And they believe that this is all in accordance with God's authority. So sitting in that class, while I had an older man tell me this is the way to interpret the Bible, whenever I had any sort of pushback or disagreement with them, I was always met with like, well, if we don't do it this way, you know, we're not obeying God's authority. And I just so believed in my core, like I could not take someone telling me how to interpret, how to think. That thought reform and that sort of control became very quickly overwhelming.
Yeah, I can imagine. So did you leave the area or did you stick around in Utah after you had left the church?
Yeah, so we were still in Utah. We lived in Ogden at the time, which is like 20 minutes north of Salt Lake City. And that's where we kind of church hopped, just sort of locally. And what's interesting is my family ended up moving within like 6 months to a year of us moving all the way back out to Utah. My family ended up moving to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because my dad got a new job. And so I felt really heartbroken because I had moved all this way after college to be closer to them. They ended up moving to Pittsburgh, but all that's fine now. I'm actually going to go see them next month,
good.
which should be fun. But yeah, so it's fine. But early on, it was very like sad, I think, for all of us, especially for them knowing that their daughter wasn't going to be in that congregation that they had hoped that I'd be in and be with the people who they've known for many years. I think that sort of security for me, it kind of left them as to like, well, what's going to happen to her? Where's she going to go now? What's she going to do? So I think that was very difficult.
Well, it sounds like shunning wasn't a factor or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it sounds like your parents stayed in touch with you
Oh, yeah.
and that sounds like a positive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We fought a lot. Anyone who leaves these groups fight a lot. And our relationship now may look a little bit differently than it did when I was still in the group. It's taken years to sort of like figure out how to vibe again, I feel like, with them. And we have boundaries. We really don't talk about the group very much. But I feel like I've also served as a safe space for them that way. Now that their children are out of the house, I feel like a lot of this sort of perfectionist facade has really come down. They've been able to turn to me, and one of them last time I visited said, "You remember that like church we attended in Texas?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "That was kind of a weird thing, right?" Or like, so like we would kind of have these like really sort of funny sideways conversations. They're still attending the Church of Christ, and I'm sure they will until the day they die, and that's fine. But we've started to have some more of these like almost sideways conversations where I've kind of learned a lot about, they've not always felt comfortable in that environment. They've gone through a lot in Churches of Christ throughout the years, and I think with me being out, they're no longer scared of like sharing some of these stories with me, because it's not like, they're trying to keep me in.
Yeah.
It's not like they're trying to shield me from
Yeah,
that.
because what's going to happen?
So it's been interesting.
Yeah, you're not going to tell on them.
Yeah.
You're not going to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must actually be kind of a relief, since they're still in, to have somebody on the outside who's like a safe person to talk to.
Yeah. And I clearly have boundaries. Anyone who still has family members that are in a high control group still has boundaries. But it's been great to even just be in conversation with them about these things. I think that's really important. And so it's been interesting the past, I don't know, like 6 years to navigate that. And our relationships have evolved, and they kind of keep revolving.
And how long have you been out?
About 6 years now.
6 years. Okay. So let's talk about where you went after you got out. I understand you got involved in helping people in Utah, I assume, leave polygamist relationships. How did you go from being in this group to doing this other sort of work? What led you there?
That's a great question. So when I had experienced spiritual abuse and all the issues with departing from that sort of belief system, I wanted to help others in my community who were experiencing that feeling. It's horrible, and it's not something that anyone should go through alone. And I started just doing research. And I came across a nonprofit out in the Salt Lake Valley that was helping people who had left polygamist groups and relationships. And I reached out, and they had me come and talk to these young women during an evening, because they thought my story would maybe resonate with them. And what was so interesting was it did in so many ways. My experience of leaving this group, some of the complications, some of the good parts of leaving. And even though like those who had left polygamous groups are just much more on the extreme end of the spectrum when it comes to coercive control, our stories could not have been more different. You still find things in common. And that's what I found in the field in general is like, Gianna, you left a totally different group than I left, but there's so much that we can find in common.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that was really beautiful. So a job position actually had opened up within a few months of volunteering with them, and I applied to be a case manager. I was helping women, children, also young men who had come out find like housing, help them with groceries, help them get their education. Sometimes it was helping them get a birth certificate. Going to court things with them. Sometimes that meant I was the 911 call when they decided to leave. I would coordinate with police and law enforcement and just have like a safe house ready to go for them. It was a really dangerous but very rewarding job and time in my life. And I was in my early 20s at this point. And that's what led me to speak at an ICSA conference. And that was my first interaction with ICSA. Was I went to the Philadelphia annual conference. I believe that was like 2019.
Okay. And for ICSA, it's International Cultic Studies Association, for those who don't know. And it's a nonprofit that basically studies high demand groups or quote unquote cults, and helps people understand what they went through and heal. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, there's a lot of events for people, everyone from those who've left groups or who are professionals, pretty much for those who've come in contact with the cultic phenomenon, really. You can be a mental health professional, researcher, legal professional. So, yeah, I went and spoke at a conference with Mark Giles. Mark Giles is a Canadian, and he was born and raised Mormon. And we gave a very interesting talk together about the changing dynamics within Mormonism. But included in that, I also had a chance to speak about my work helping polygamists out in Utah. Yeah, so that was kind of how I got into touch in all these other areas as well.
Yeah, I wanted to, I guess, elaborate a little bit on the differences and the similarities because, yeah, when I think of a high pressure Christian organization and then I compare it to a polygamist organization, I see the connections and control. But I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit more about that. What similarities you saw between what you were raised in and working with these other organizations that seem so different.
Yeah, I think with any, especially within like Christian groups or those who have any affiliation with usage of the language surrounding God, Jesus, Christ, heaven, hell, the terms used in spiritually abusive groups can be very similar. The fear that people have if they don't do the right thing can be very similar. And that expands outside of the Christian context for those who choose to depart from a belief system. Normally, high control groups instill a real fear that you just cannot exist or thrive outside of the influence of the group. And that can keep a lot of people from leaving. I mean, for me, I had a lot of fear about my salvation. I didn't have fear about my physical safety, but I had fear about losing my salvation. For a lot of these women, that was also true. So for some, there was also a physical fear. Like, I'm worried about someone in the group coming after me or.
Yeah, was that something that happened often when you were assisting people? Was there like an element of actual physical danger?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When I would come to and respond to a call of someone who had decided to leave, for example, one of the first things we would do is check under their car for tracking devices. They would typically have a tracking device and turn that over to the police. But yes, absolutely, we had to get really creative in helping women, especially with a lot of these groups, particularly surrounding the Kingston group, the Kingstons. There's a lot of articles on them online. You can go and read in depth.
And there was a reality show about them, right? Escaping Polygamy. Are we talking about the same group here?
Yeah.
I totally
binged
all of
we
that.
Are.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
We are. Yeah. What's interesting is the people on the show contacted our nonprofit director at the time and asked if we could be featured as case managers on the show, helping women do some of these escapes. But obviously because of like privacy, we weren't in the position to do that. So we were never on the show. But yeah, I mean, it can get wild. Helping people leave these groups, you can be watched, you can be followed. I've been run out of neighborhoods before. I've had to pretend that I was someone else entirely because if someone found out I was a case manager, I was told that they were going to kill me.
Oh my God.
I was one of 2 case managers in the state of Utah that particularly help this population. So I was very well known within these communities, and there's many times where people would try to intimidate me, my physical safety. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
That sounds really scary. And when you were, quote, rescuing people from polygamous organizations, what were you rescuing them from? Like, why couldn't they just get up and walk away like you did?
Sometimes they just didn't have the resources. Sometimes they didn't even have a car to leave. Maybe it wasn't so much that someone was coming after them or they were worried about that, but sometimes they didn't have a car. Sometimes they didn't have money. Sometimes they didn't have a safe space with someone outside of the group, and they contact our organization to like facilitate and be a safe space to helping them actually get out, or their children. Some women aren't trapped in those relationships, so to speak. Some women and children can leave at any time, but in many instances, that's not the case. For some, depending on the group, if there's any suspicion about a woman's activities, like I said, when I'm pulling tracking devices off cars, I know that these women are being monitored and followed. And if they send a text to someone like me who's outside of the group, they may be beaten, they may be questioned as to why they're doing that. And it's quite horrible. I mean, there's young women who get sent over to Grand Junction, Colorado, for example, because there it's legal to marry close cousins. So you get married so young in the group, sometimes the older men, sometimes the relatives, and the whole family's involved in keeping you there in that system. And there can be many barriers to leaving. But also, like, I once helped somebody who had left, and the next day, this took months for her to get to the mental space to where she was ready to leave. And the next day, she was being transported somewhere by a friend of mine who was helping with her case. And she had a full breakdown in the car. She was terrified that she was going to get struck down by God for leaving the group. And she had her children with her, and she ultimately decided to go back. And those kinds of situations happen, unfortunately, and it's heartbreaking. But, when cults strip people of their autonomy, the worst thing that you can do is try to, physically keep someone out. If they're going to go back, they're going to go back. You have to almost give them their autonomy back. You need to let them make the decisions that they want and just be there when they're ready. And so sometimes leaving can happen multiple times in different ways for a lot of these people.
It's incredibly similar to a domestic violence situation.
It can be. Yeah.
People leave many times before they do the final leaving.
Yeah.
That sounds very similar to certain controlling groups as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think that gives us a good segue into our broader conversation. And, being as that you were raised in a controlling organization, you did this work to help people get out of polygamous organizations. I thought that you would be a great person to have a conversation with about what is a cult. It is the most basic question. I feel like it's something that people argue about, but I just feel like before we even go any further in this season, I would just like to kind of discuss it and I guess in some way explain why there are some groups we're talking about as being controlling and unhealthy, but we're not basically putting down all religions or all organizations in general.
I think it's a great question. So when you Google the term cult, which, when I'm trying to find out something, I just Google the term itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you Google the term cult, what comes up is, and I'm going to read some of these brief definitions, is a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. I think that's interesting, that definition, because it indicates that it has to be religious in nature. Another definition is a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. I actually hate that definition.
Yeah, I don't like that definition. I really don't like that definition. It just makes so many assumptions and
yes, it's horrible.
It's like
it's
everyone
horrible.
thinks something's strange. I mean, yeah,
I know.
That is one thing that I do get asked about. It's like, okay, well, it's just because it's a small religion and I think it's weird because they wear, purple hats on Tuesdays or whatever it is that they do, like that makes it a cult. And like, I definitely wouldn't agree with that.
Isn't that, it like makes the hair on my arm stand up. I don't like it. And then the third definition that comes up is a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing.
Okay. And
that's like better. Yeah, I think it's better, but I still don't like it. So in other words, like our understanding of cults has changed so much. When cults increased rapidly during the 1960s, when we had things like Jonestown as like the mainstream examples of cults, really extreme scenarios, horrible endings, that one sinister cult leader, narcissist was behind it. That was 1960s. And then by the late 1970s, psychotherapists like Margaret Sanger, which many people have heard of, paved the way for more widespread knowledge on the effects of cult involvement amongst other professionals in the 1980s. So even from like the 1960s to 1980s, there's more conversations happening about how to define the term cult.
Well, how would you define it?
How would I define it?
Yeah.
Is a great question. Can I answer that question by reading, I guess, one of my favorite definitions of cult?
Sure. Yes,
Okay.
please.
So one definition of cult, and this indicates a totalist type of cult. It's long. You ready?
Okay, go for it.
A group or movement exhibiting a great or excessive devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing, and employing unethically manipulative techniques of persuasion and control, such as isolation from former friends and family, debilitation, use of special methods to heighten suggestibility and subservience, powerful group pressures, information management, suspension of individuality or critical judgment, promotion of total dependency on the group and fear of leaving it, designed to advance the goals of the group's leaders to the actual or possible detriment of members, their families, or the community. That was a mouthful.
Yeah. I kind of sometimes think a mouthful is necessary when trying to describe something like a cult.
Yeah.
I know people want to be pithy and like put everything in this like small, quick hit, like this is what it is. And
Yeah.
it's like, unfortunately, when it comes to cults, everything is complicated and mushy, including the sheer definition of it.
That's why I like this definition. I like this definition for a few reasons. And this definition was developed in 1986. Like I mentioned earlier, by the 1980s, our understandings of cults have changed. And this definition was created by West and Langone. But what's so interesting about this definition and why I like it is because it not only says that, like, it doesn't say that cults have to be religious in nature. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions.
Exactly.
It also doesn't say that a cult has to have a charismatic leader, which is also one of the biggest misconceptions. I like how it says devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing.
Yeah.
Because I think that really goes beyond our very binary understandings of a charismatic leader, something very extreme like Jonestown, or like some sort of religious offshoot living in a cave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I like that this is a mouthful. I agree with you. And I think because there's so much shoved into this definition, I think it can be beneficial to highlight what kinds of elements can be at play within cults. What I took from that definition and how I define cult, Deanna, because I know you want to know. It's nothing wild. It's nothing new. But from that definition, how I define cult is a group that is united in a particular cause or by a particular person or united by a particular idea. And cultic groups have to include thought reform. Cultic groups have control over many facets of members' lives. So it has to be united. Typically, there is a thought reform, undue influence component. And it also has to have not only an implementation of coercive control, but also there is a restriction of autonomy. And that restriction of autonomy can look very different depending on the context. Sometimes it can be as extreme as physical safety, where you can go, who you can talk to. But sometimes the restriction of autonomy has to do more in the psychological, spiritual realm. What can I question? What can I read? What can I believe without fear? And so that's how I define cult. These are the essential elements that I feel makes up a cult: is thought reform, implementation of coercive control, a restriction of autonomy, and that it's united with a certain mission in mind. And that was largely pulled from that very broad, long definition. But
yeah, no, I like that definition too. And in fact, I even used it in my dissertation, my master's dissertation.
That's the one I used as well.
So both of our master's dissertations have this definition in it. I thought it was a good definition. Especially, I think important is the restriction of people's autonomy. I think that is such a huge factor in defining something as a cult.
Yeah.
If somebody loses their ability to choose for themselves, that's so harmful. And I think that is what makes a group harmful.
Yeah.
Another thing that people have brought up to me that I do like to include: how much do you lose when you leave?
Yeah.
If you leave the group, is it just like, oh, okay, on to the next thing, like, okay, bye? Or is it like, now no one's going to talk to you. Now people are spying on you.
Yeah.
Now your family doesn't, like, I just feel like that's a really good indication.
Yeah. When people ask me, well, how do I know if I'm in a high control group? I always turn that around and I say, well, what would happen if you choose to leave? Because sometimes they're thinking about the here and now context and not so much of the ramifications of what that would actually look like. And
Exactly.
so I totally agree with you. And I want to touch on language because language is really important. And for some people who have left high control, coercively controlling situations, it is absolutely essential, important, and also empowering for them to say, I left a cult, for them to understand what a cult may mean to them. In that sense, I feel like definitional ambiguity of the term cult can be really positive because so many people's experiences are so unique that if the term cult and your understanding of cult resonates with you, then using that term can just be extremely empowering because it really can put a term to your situation in a way that can be understood. So I think language can be really powerful in that sense.
Yeah.
Definitions themselves can serve as such a helpful framework. I like definitions serving as a framework. And I feel like when it comes to the term cult, a definition to the term cult, if anything, is a helpful framework to better understand the variables involved in creating totalist systems, in my opinion.
Unfortunately, it's so loaded.
It's so loaded. Absolutely.
I mean, it's so negative, and that's an argument people have made to me as far as like, you shouldn't use the word cult. It's like, well, it, implies all of these things. First of all, I'm okay with it implying certain things. Yeah, there is some sort of unhealthy level of devotion. There are these unhealthy things happening, but I don't know. I like what you said about it being empowering for people to use that word if that's how they feel, if they feel that it applies.
Yeah.
Because what one person thinks is a cult, another person might not. And that doesn't make the person who thinks they were in a cult not in a cult.
Right.
Sometimes even applies to someone's own experience and interpretation.
Yeah, I feel like it's really important to acknowledge, for me at least, I like using a fluidity in this kind of terminology. Whether it's a cult, totalist system, spiritually abusive church, destructive group setting, abusive group setting, psychologically abusive environment, and it can go on and on. But I know especially for those in a Christian context, if you've left a Christian church, if it was the Christian church down the street where you experienced spiritual abuse or cultic stuff, for many people who've left Christian groups, spiritual abuse is sort of the easiest first step. And the term spiritual abuse resonates more so with those leaving abusive Christian environments than those who've left other groups, maybe. And so I hear the term spiritual abuse a lot. And so sometimes people may use that kind of stepping stone as well, this term feels good to me right now. Maybe later it may not, especially when there's a lot of education that they're absorbing and learning about coercive control. Maybe later on, cult, they feel maybe better to fit their situation or describe their experience. But for now, it may be this. I choose to respect how people label their situation. And whatever that is, I never question it. I choose to respect what label speaks well to them, or if they even choose to label it. If they approach it with the fluidity as well, they're calling it XYZ, I'll also refer to it as XYZ,
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to respect people's experiences in that regard.
Well, exactly, because the last thing you want to do to somebody who's coming out of a controlling situation is tell them you can't explain it that way. No, you're wrong. You can't say that. That's probably, I would assume, very
it's horrible.
triggering. Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, it'd be horrible. I think ultimately within the greater conversation, education surrounding cults is so needed, but also in our background, Deanna, is education surrounding coercive control is vital, because I feel like when it comes to coercive control, there's almost more of this universality and experience for those who have been affected by coercive control. Not everyone has been in a cult, but have we all experienced coercion in some way, or at least the majority of the population experienced coercion in some way? And so I almost feel like education surrounding dynamics involved in coercive control, that certainly can probably speak to more of the population than those who have been involved in groups, but also the result of that can be inadvertently educating people on what occurs within cultic groups. I think these two subjects are just so intrinsically tied, and education on both are so vitally important. And not everyone who experiences coercive control has been in a cultic setting. But I believe that people in cultic settings have experienced some form of coercion,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And just for clarity's sake, give me an example of a coercive situation.
I think from like thinking back to my experience, I think for me, it was more of like a spiritually coercive situation. Like, if you don't believe the scriptures this way,
Hmm.
then your salvation's at risk. And man, did that scare me to death to think about going to hell, especially when fire and brimstone was like actually a belief and it was talked about. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And I almost felt like my spiritual life was being held hostage because of those beliefs. And I think that that can be a form of coercion, and it can also be considered spiritual abuse when that kind of thing is applied. For me, coercion can involve some sort of strong fear component. Like, if
Yeah.
you leave or do this, then you will face punishment. That's not always a situation, I'm sure, but just what comes to mind is that there's often a fear component that's tied.
Yeah, I think that's right. You're being driven by fear, like your safety in some way is in danger. I wanted to talk about how cults aren't always religious. That's one defining thing that I think people get confused about. It has to be religious. Also, it has to have a leader. And I feel like it's not necessarily the case. It doesn't have to be a religious group. And also, there doesn't have to be a charismatic leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think thought reform, which I think is also essential in defining, a cult environment, or it's something that we often see from those who've left cultic groups. Thought reform can exist outside of a charismatic leader. Sometimes it can be the result of cultural or spiritual beliefs or practices. I know for my group, it was implemented through how to interpret the Bible. And, that was all without the context of a leader. And yet I would go home after leaving church. And if I was curious about something or wanted to do something else, like if I wanted to listen to like religious music that had like instruments, there would be that thought of like, oh, is this okay to do?
Mhm.
So even though I didn't have a leader, that influence existed in my head, almost like how it would with the existence of a leader, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
So thought reform can happen without a leader. I think that's important. And I also think that's what keeps a lot of people from understanding and acknowledging. I guess for me, that kept me from getting resources for a long time,
Mm.
because I assumed that you had to have a charismatic leader. And for me, that wasn't the case. So I was very nervous to enter like the cult recovery community because of that. I
Mm.
didn't really understand. And I think in terms of religious, obviously there's business cults.
Yeah.
MLMs can be a whole conversation. There's so many cultic environments that can exist also within family units. A family unit can certainly operate culty.
Yeah.
A parent can almost enact over their family as a cult leader would. And that can exist totally outside the context of religion or a church environment or a commune environment. So that's just my quick thoughts.
No, those are really good thoughts. And I think that might be one thing that stops people from seeking help or digging further into their situation. They feel like whatever group they're in, whether it's a church or whether it's a multi-level marketing business opportunity, or whether it's, I don't know, like a really, really strict book club. I mean, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that those like strict definitions or interpretations they have of like, well, this isn't really a cult because of this. It's, oh, we didn't have a leader. Like there's a lot of conversation now about QAnon. And
Yeah.
one thing I hear a lot from people is like, it's not a cult because there's no leader. And it's like, that doesn't make it not a cult.
Yeah, if you're unified by a similar idea. That's why I like that longer definition of cult, because that was one of the first ones I had seen that acknowledged that you don't have to be united by one person. You could be united by a cause, by a
Yeah,
mission. There's political cults.
exactly.
There's all kinds. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, there was a lot of debate over what, is it a cult? Is it not a cult? And I think one thing that stopped me from really even considering it that way until pretty recently was I thought that cults were just these extreme groups, because you think cult and you think like Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, like stockpiling weapons, mass suicides, like this. So like I think cult also implies, or people think it implies, like some sort of dramatic, violent outcome. Whereas what I was raised in was kind of, I mean, we had some issues. We had a charismatic leader. There were problems. But like, you know, it was a pretty mellow commune.
Yeah.
And nothing like we never, you know, nothing just like, we never had some big tragic incident. And yeah, again, like I think, you know, for myself and then also for other people I know who have come out of the same group, one thing that keeps them from considering that it might have been a cult, that there might have been controlling aspects that were unhealthy to them, is that, well, it wasn't Jonestown.
Yeah. It is sad. I mean, I was talking to someone just yesterday and they said, I didn't know where I belonged, or you know, how cult recovery could apply to me, because I left this like patchwork of groups, is what they said. And once we were kind of diving into that more, it sounded like the father and the family would take them to different church services and groups. And we had a long conversation about influence and where influence can arise in all these different scenarios and situations. So even just the assumption that, well, I don't know how cult recovery fits in my situation, because it just, for me, it just wasn't one thing. It wasn't one group. I feel like that applies to all of us. Influence, negative influence, can come from all different kinds of situations, group involved or non-group involved. And so I'm really happy that we're broadening these conversations and that we're moving away from this very intense view of cult, which can very much still so exist. Like, of course, there are still very abusive extreme groups, but I like how we're talking about more of these interpersonal dynamics and sources of influence and control and how that can apply.
Well, I think it's really important to give attention to the subtleties, because once you start discounting them, you have people who are suffering in some way, but they don't know how it happened and they can't explain it, or they don't feel validated.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the same time, I don't want to discount some of these really abusive groups.
Absolutely.
You know, obviously, Jonestown was terrible. All the recent information about Nexium, like, that was awful. Horrible things happened to those people.
Yeah.
And of course, coming from my background as a journalist, in defense of, you know, the more extreme information getting out there, I mean, that's what you cover. Like, usually, like, some sort of newsworthy event happens, and that's what gets the attention, because that's what people pay attention to. So I feel like there's a good reason that people feel that way about cults, because, like, why would you hear about just this commune down the street and, like, maybe people within it are feeling oppressed, but no one did anything overt? So, like, you know, why would there be an article about it? Why would there be some in-depth thing about it?
I like how you referred to your group as being a mellow commune.
Yeah.
That really painted a picture for me.
As opposed to all those crazy communes. I don't know. I'm sure there are some communes that were probably far more exciting and controversial than mine. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But like, at the same time, I don't think you can totally discount it. I mean, again, there was a very unhealthy, charismatic leader who dictated what people said and did. Like, the way I lived and the way I ate since birth was basically dictated by someone else.
Yeah.
I don't think that's healthy.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. These conversations are really important.
I think so too.
I'm glad we're having them.
Me too. And I'd like to have more conversations like this, you know, moving forward in the podcast. Well, thank you so much for your time, Ashlen. And
thank you, Deanna.
I look forward to talking more to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that is our first episode of season 3. Thank you for listening today, and a big thank you to Ashlen for being here. Like I said at the beginning of the show, you're going to be hearing more of Ashlen this season. On the next episode, she'll be interviewing me, and then you're going to hear her on future episodes as well. The show is produced and hosted by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Leanne Dunn, and opening and closing music by the band The Chaw. If you like the show and you'd like to support it, we now have a Patreon page, so you can go online and check that out. We'll see you next time.